Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, April 3rd, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Israel bombed foreign aid workers 3 times until they were all killed. So Haaretz, the Israeli paper, reported on Tuesday that Israel launched 3 separate drone strikes on an aid convoy in its attack that killed 7 aid workers for the World Central Kitchen. So I covered this briefly yesterday, that the fact that Israel killed these foreign aid workers in Gaza, and now more details came out about this horrific attack. And it says this report, and this is essentially the story, the official story coming out of Israel. This was citing Israeli military sources, and it said that one Israeli drone fired 3 missiles at 3 cars that were clearly marked with the World Central Kitchen's logos and were traveling on roads pre-approved by the Israeli military. So they coordinated what they were doing with the Israeli military. So again, 3 cars here, and after the first car was hit, a second car took the wounded people from the first car, and then the second car was hit with a missile, and the third car went back and picked up survivors from that strike, and then the third missile strike hit the third car and finished the job. And it killed, again, 7 aid workers, including 3 British nationals, a dual American-Canadian citizen, so an American was killed, a Palestinian was killed, an Australian, and a Polish citizen. Israeli officials have claimed that the airstrikes were a mistake, but the meticulous nature of the operation suggests that this was a targeted killing of aid workers and part of Israel's campaign to starve Palestinians. In response to this strike, several aid organizations have suspended operations in Gaza. Aid has been turned away from Gaza, and this is contributing to the starvation of Palestinians. So according to Israeli sources speaking to Haaretz, the 3 cars were hit after escorting an aid truck to a food warehouse in central Gaza. The sources said that the Israeli unit responsible for the route that these people were killed on, so they claimed to identify an armed man on the aid truck and suspected that he was a terrorist, according to this report. Now, the fact that it said they suspected he was a terrorist means that they had no idea if he was, a member of Hamas or anything. And the idea of an armed man on an aid truck could just be security for the aid shipment, since there's been looting, and Israel has repeatedly targeted Gaza's police officers who guard aid convoys, has killed a lot of them. So this is a pattern. They see an armed person on an aid truck. Obviously, it's probably security or something, but they think that they should kill them. But anyway, it's kind of irrelevant because this alleged armed man, they're saying he was the justification for the strike, but he was on the aid truck, and the cars were hit after they dropped the aid truck off at a warehouse, and they were heading back the way that they came. So even that, so it's irrelevant, but that's what these officials are saying was the just excuse, I guess, for these strikes, which, of course, this reminds me of that video of the Israeli drone strike that killed those 4 unarmed Palestinian men that was released, because you saw the one strike that killed 2 of them, and then a third and fourth strike to finish off the people who survived. So this seems to be a pattern of the Israeli airstrikes. No matter who they are, if they're unarmed or not, they're going to finish off whoever they're bombing, they're drone striking. So then there's another report from Haaretz that cited Israeli sources who said the strikes happened not because of a lack of coordination between aid groups and the Israeli military, but because Israeli officers operating in Gaza do whatever they want. So that sounds like they have free reign to kill and shoot whoever they want. And that lines up with that other report about the kill zones in Gaza. So believe it or not, the White House appeared to defend the Israeli slaughter of aid workers during a press briefing on Tuesday. And this is John Kirby. He claimed that there was no evidence that it was a deliberate strike in an exchange that he had with a reporter. So he was asked by this reporter if killing aid workers violated international humanitarian law. And Kirby said, quote, "Your question presumes at this very early hour that it was a deliberate strike, that they knew exactly what they were hitting, that they were hitting aid workers and did it on purpose. There's no evidence of that," end quote. And this press briefing was on Tuesday afternoon when this stuff was out about the 3 missile strikes. And Kirby also repeated this lie from the State Department that there's no evidence Israel has violated any international law in Gaza. I mean, it's completely absurd. So this is Kirby said, quote, "I will also remind you that we continue to look at incidents as they occur. The State Department has a process in place, and to date, as you and I are speaking today, they have not found any incidents where the Israelis have violated international humanitarian law," end quote. So just a complete joke. And this just goes to show how the U.S. is aiding and abetting, supporting in every possible way that it can this slaughter, this genocidal war against the Palestinians in Gaza. And Israel has been bombing aid workers throughout the war. This is something that's been known for months now. Hundreds of employees of the UN's Palestinian Relief Agency, UNRWA, have been killed. And back in November, Politico reported that the U.S. was sharing with Israel the location of aid groups in Gaza, saying that the idea was to avoid strikes on those areas. But Israel was bombing them anyway. So, of course, the U.S. is implicated there in giving Israel intelligence to kill aid workers. I mean, it's just, I don't know really what to say about how I just can't believe that they're supporting this so much, how even incidents like this don't change anything. I mean, it's just really, really despicable stuff. And then the next story here, the Israeli siege is causing a sharp rise in newborn baby deaths in Gaza. So the most innocent people are the ones who are suffering the most when it comes to the blockade and siege. So the World Health Organization said on Tuesday that newborn mortality rates are rising sharply in the Gaza Strip due to the U.S.-backed Israeli bombing campaign and starvation blockade. WHO spokeswoman Margaret Harris said, quote, "From different doctors, particularly in the maternity hospitals, they're reporting that they're seeing a big rise in children born with low birth weight and just not surviving the neonatal period because they're born too small," end quote. So Harris said that the WHO does not have precise statistics on the newborn mortality rate just due to the devastation in Gaza and Israel's attacks on hospitals. Hospitals are barely functioning, the ones that haven't been completely destroyed. The Israeli military recently withdrew from Al-Shifa Hospital after a 15-day siege, leaving it completely destroyed and a pile of dead bodies in its wake. Doctors in Gaza have said that they're also seeing a rise in women losing their pregnancies and stillborn births due to malnutrition and a lack of clean drinking water. NBC News spoke with a Palestinian woman, a 22-year-old who just had a stillbirth. She said, quote, "The doctors told me malnutrition had a big role in this. I was not able to eat properly. I didn't take vitamins. There was nothing available. The water was polluted. I was feeling it," end quote. And this woman's husband was killed by an Israeli airstrike, so she lost her husband and her baby because of the Israeli siege on Gaza. According to the UN's Population Fund, there are about 155,000 pregnant women and new mothers who are struggling to survive in Gaza. And there are 5,500 women who will give birth in the next month. And they're saying, of course, the struggles that they're going to have and the risk of their baby dying, of them dying. I mean, this is something I really, as a father of a 7-month-old baby and a 2.5-year-old, this stuff really makes it seem real to me. Just imagining these situations for these women and their husbands, and if they're alive, dealing with trying to take care of a newborn baby. I mean, it's stressful and scary enough, and having to do it in these conditions It's just completely horrific. And so this Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza has been a war on children and babies from the very beginning. In November, the Israeli military left 4 premature babies to die at the Al Nasser Children's Hospital in northern Gaza. Those were the babies who were found decomposing in their hospital beds. And again, this is in November. This stuff has been going on this whole time. And at least 13,000 children have been killed in the Israeli bombing campaign, and that's considered a low estimate because it doesn't count the thousands who are under the rubble. And this isn't taken into account. It's not clear how many babies and children have died of starvation, malnutrition, or causes like this. Who knows if we're ever really going to know the true toll of this thing. All right, so the next one here. Doctors say that children have been targeted by Israeli snipers in Gaza. So this article is from The Guardian, and I'll just read a little bit of it. It's very long, but the fact that they have Israeli children who are coming in with bullets in their brains. Dr. Fozia Alvi was making her rounds of the intensive care unit on her final day at the battered European public hospital in southern Gaza when she stopped next to 2 young arrivals with facial injuries and breathing tubes in their windpipes. She said, quote, "I asked the nurse, what's the history? She said that they were brought in a couple of hours ago. They had sniper shots to the brain. They were 7 or 8 years old," end quote. The Canadian doctor's heart sank. These were not the first children treated by Alvi, who she was told were targeted by Israeli soldiers, and she knew the damage a single high-caliber bullet could do to a fragile young body. She said, quote, "They were not able to talk, paraplegic. They were literally lying down as vegetables on those beds. They were not the only ones. I saw even small children with direct sniper shot wounds to the head as well as in the chest. They were not combatants. They were small children," end quote. So 9 doctors gave The Guardian accounts of working in Gaza hospitals this year, all but one of them foreign volunteers. Their common assessment was that most of the dead and wounded children they treated were hit by shrapnel or burned during Israel's extensive bombardment of residential neighborhoods, in some cases wiping out entire families. Others were killed or injured by collapsing buildings, with still more missing under the rubble. But doctors also reported treating a steady stream of children, elderly people, and others who were clearly not combatants with single bullet wounds to the head or the chest. And some of the physicians said the types of locations of the wounds and accounts of Palestinians who brought children to the hospital led them to believe the victims were directly targeted by Israeli troops. So again, there's a lot here to this story. If you want to go check it out, I think these accounts from Gaza hospitals are really important of just the horror show that is happening there. You know, there's a picture in here of a brain scan of a child's brain showing a bullet lodged into it. This is this brain scan of a 8-year-old Palestinian girl with a bullet in her brain. All right, so the next one here, Iran says that Israel will be punished for bombing the consulate. So Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei vowed on Tuesday that Israel will be punished for bombing Iran's consulate building in Damascus, which killed senior members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. Khamenei said, quote, or Khamenei, his name is very similar to the first Ayatollah Khomeini, but his name is pronounced Khamenei. He said, quote, "The evil Zionist regime will be punished by our courageous men. We will make them regret this and other crimes like it by God's power and strength," end quote. So this statement came as Iranian media reported that the death toll in the Israeli attack has risen to 13, which includes 7 Iranians and 6 Syrians. Among the dead were General Mohammad Reza Zahedi, a senior IRGC commander who oversaw Quds Force operations in Syria and Lebanon, and his deputy, another General Mohammad Hadi Haji Rahimi. So Israel's bombing of a diplomatic facility, of course, marks a huge escalation in its attacks on Iranians. Just completely crazy that this has happened, and the U.S. doesn't seem like this is really impacting things. So Israel, what else was I going to say? Oh, I have another story about this. Sorry, I thought there was another topic related to this that was in this story, but that's in another one, so I'll get to that. But the bottom line here is that this risk of an Iranian response is very real, And Iran is usually, again, a lot of their guys have been killed by Israel over the past few months, and they haven't done anything. One thing we always have to keep in mind is that Israel has nukes. Israel has nuclear weapons. And considering all of the insane, horrific things that they have done in Gaza, that they continue to do in Gaza, I wouldn't put them past to be willing to use those nukes on Iran if it comes down to it. That's just where we're at right now. There's nothing I would put past them, and there's nothing I would put past the U.S. government supporting and backing up. All right, so the next one here, as attacks escalate, Israeli defense minister prepares the public for a war in Lebanon. So this article is from Jason Ditz. Israeli Army Chief Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi has reportedly signed off on a plan to launch a major war on the country's northern front with Lebanon, and this comes amid growing escalation of Israeli attacks and a palpable sense that the diplomatic efforts are not gaining much momentum in avoiding the conflict. So Halevi had ordered plans prepared last month and reportedly held an assessment with the northern commander in the IDF, in which they both decided that the plan was appropriate. So Defense Minister Yoav Gallant is reportedly having his staff work on various proposals for gearing up the general public for an all-out military conflict with Hezbollah, and ominously enough, for the possibility of war with Iran. The goal, according to reports, is to raise awareness of the possibility of a war, even if one is not imminent, and not to panic, but to raise awareness. Israel's Home Front Command has long been preparing for sheltering civilians in the north in the event that, this big war breaks out. So this is what the Israelis are thinking. They're preparing for this major war, and they're trying to provoke it as well. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. told Iran that it had no involvement in bombing the consulate in Syria. And this is what, for some reason, I thought this was included in that other article. But anyway, so Axios reported on Monday that the U.S. told Iran it had no involvement or advanced knowledge of the Israeli airstrike that targeted a consulate building next to the Iranian embassy in Damascus, Syria. A senior U.S. official said the U.S. had sent the message directly to Iran. The U.S. has a history of approving Israeli airstrikes in Syria. I linked to a report from the Wall Street Journal from about 2 years ago that said the U.S. approves many of Israel's airstrikes in Syria. But U.S. and Israeli officials insist that the U.S. was only notified of the strike minutes before it was launched. The officials said that Israel was not looking for a green light from the U.S. and that little detail was shared. So this is really another detail in this report that I thought was really something is the fact that this strike took place. They bombed this embassy, this consulate, right before Blinken and Jake Sullivan had this video conference with Israeli officials about Israel's plans to attack Rafah. And despite this strike being a huge escalation and a blatant violation of international law, Blinken and Sullivan apparently didn't bring it up in this 2.5-hour video conference, which is really incredible to me. And the message to Iran, it signals that the U.S. is worried that it's going to blow back on them. And if you look at this idea, if you remember back when there was a lot of attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria, they kept saying that Iran was responsible because they arm the groups that were behind the attacks. Well, by that logic, that means the U.S. is responsible for Israel bombing the embassy with an F-35. So, use that logic, it could come back to bite you. And there was, according to U.S. officials, a one-way attack drone was fired at the Al-Tanf garrison, which is one of the U.S.'s main bases in Syria. There was no report of damage or injuries or anything, but could be a sign of things to come. All right, so the next one here, NATO chief floats a $100 billion fund for Ukraine. So NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg will propose establishing a $100 billion five-year fund for Ukraine when the alliance's foreign ministers meet on Wednesday. So the idea is to lock in long-term support for Ukraine amid uncertainty around U.S. aid to Ukraine, as the $60 billion that President Biden is seeking for the proxy war still hasn't been authorized by Congress. The plan is also meant to prevent any future U.S. president from withdrawing support from Ukraine. So Financial Times described this as Trump-proofing the proxy war, since the former president has expressed opposition to the conflict, although recently he was talking about how they should just loan the money to Ukraine. So Politico reported that one idea would involve the 32 members of the alliance contributing to this $100 billion fund at the same rate that they contribute to NATO's budget. That, of course, would put most of the burden on the U.S. The U.S. pays for 2/3 of NATO's budget. And so we'll see what happens. Stoltenberg is hoping to get this plan worked out before there's a NATO summit that's happening in Washington this summer. There's going to be some opposition probably from Hungary and Slovakia. Let's see if they can convince them to get on board with this. But this is just goes to show that no matter what the situation is on the battlefield, the risk of escalation with all these Ukrainian attacks inside Russia, they just want to keep this thing going. Just want to keep the cash cow going. All right, so the next one here, Zelensky signs law lowering the conscription age to 25. So Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky signed a bill into law on Tuesday that lowers the age of eligible conscripts for mobilization from 27 to 25. The bill was passed by Ukraine's parliament last May, but it had been sitting on Zelensky's desk for nearly a year, since expanding the draft is unpopular among Ukrainians as war fatigue has been setting in. Zelensky also signed 2 other laws aimed at getting more troops for the failing war effort against Russia. One of these laws requires men who have been declared only partially fit for service to undergo another medical examination. So these are men that this is a specific category, partially fit, and then the other categories are fit for duty or unfit for duty. So this would get rid of the partially fit category and make them have another medical exemption. So people with some medical problems that they're trying to get basically approved for duty. So another law will establish an electronic database for military-age men between the ages of 17 and 60 as Ukraine looks to mobilize hundreds of thousands of fresh troops. Under martial law, men aged 18 to 60 cannot leave the country. And Zelensky signed these laws a few weeks after Lindsey Graham visited Ukraine and demanded a change to the conscription laws. Graham said while he was in Ukraine, quote, "I would hope that those eligible to serve in the Ukrainian military would join. I can't believe it's at 27. You're in a fight for your life, so you should be serving, not at 25 or 27. We need more people in the line," end quote. So send more young Ukrainian men into the meat grinder is what Graham wants. And he infamously said back in 2022 that Ukraine, if the U.S. gives them enough weapons, Ukraine would be willing to fight to the last person, fight to the last Ukrainian. All right, so the next story here, McConnell says that he'll fight the isolationist movement. So Senator Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, he has vowed that he will stay in the Senate to fight against what he called an isolationist movement within the GOP, referring to Republicans who oppose the proxy war in Ukraine. So earlier this year, McConnell, who's 82 years old, he said that he would step down from his position as the Senate GOP leader this November after nearly 2 decades. In a radio interview on Monday, McConnell said that he will stay in the Senate despite stepping down from that position, at least until his term ends in 2026. McConnell said, quote, "I'm particularly involved in actually fighting back against the isolationist movement in my own party and some in the other as well. And the symbol of that lately is, are we going to help Ukraine or not? I've got this sort of on my mind for the next couple years as something I'm going to focus on," end quote. So he's saying he's staying in Senate to fight against this. And McConnell has been leading the charge in the Senate on the Ukraine proxy war and previously declared arming Ukraine is the #1 priority for Republicans in Congress. And during this interview, it was interesting. He also discussed Rand Paul, who's the other Republican senator from Kentucky. And Rand Paul has been consistently opposed to arming Ukraine. And McConnell said he was worried that more people in the Republican Party are thinking like Rand Paul. He said, quote, "What's made it more troublesome is, it seems to me, others are heading in that direction, making arguments that are easily refuted." I mean, his arguments are easily refuted, I would say. And then he went on to say that the U.S. isn't losing any troops. The Ukrainians are the only ones doing the fighting, basically saying Ukrainians are dying. Who cares about that? Let's keep this thing going. And of course, he's calling these Republicans isolationists, which is an old smear tactic to they always use against opponents of wars, and that doesn't fit most of these Republicans. The vast majority, virtually all of them, support arming Israel to support the slaughter in Gaza, and the majority of them also think the U.S. should be building up its military in the Asia Pacific to prepare for a future war with China. In fact, unfortunately, a lot of the opposition, the Republican opposition to arming Ukraine, is rooted in this idea that, well, we should be using these resources over there. So there's also that aspect to it. Rand Paul is actually one of the few Republicans I've seen speak out against the China stuff. One of the few people in Congress I've seen speak out against it. All right, so the last story here. President Biden held a phone call with Chinese President Xi Jinping, the first since 2022. They did hold a summit last year, but this is kind of a typical call. Apparently, they talked for a while. They said that they held a candid and in-depth exchange of views on topics ranging from counter-narcotics cooperation to climate change. This article is from South China Morning Post, by the way. It's their summary of the call. It says that Xi criticized President Biden's endless stream of measures to suppress China's economy, trade, science, and technology. That's, of course, referring to all these sanctions that Biden, pretty serious sanction that Biden has imposed on China's tech industry. And Xi Jinping also said that Taiwan is the first red line that must not be crossed in the U.S.-China relationship, something that he has said repeatedly to Biden, something that I don't think is seeking in. That goes to show how important the issue is for China, that they call it the first red line that must not be crossed. And this call, I believe, came before Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, is preparing to make a trip to China. So that is it for the news for today. Go check out our Viewpoints. One from Norman Solomon. Latest U.S. transfer of 2,000-pound bombs to Israel is not newsworthy to the New York Times. Apparently, they didn't report on it. One from Ted Snyder. America's disregard for law and life. One from Doug Bandow. U.S. officials believe that we are at war with Russia. One from Sheldon Richmond. Israel was humiliated on October 7th. The spotlight is from Gideon Levy. Every person killed in Gaza has a name. So please go check all of that out. Support this show by sharing, liking, subscribing. One thing I haven't talked about in a while that I've been meaning to is the Defend the Guard Act. I really want people to sign up to volunteer for them, to help them with phone banking, to help get this legislation passed that would restrict the deployment of a state's National Guard to a combat zone where Congress has not declared war. I've been putting the link to the phone banking in the description. You could also just go to the website, defendtheguard.us, to see what its status is in your state, and maybe you could do something in your state. But that is it for me for today. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.